My father gave me a cold smile from across the patio table. "You will never have a car like your brother's Claire." My mother stayed quiet, but nodded in agreement, adjusting her designer silk scarf. My brother Brandon leaned back in his chair, swirling his overpriced wine, then smirked and looked me up and down. "Let us be honest. You were never on my level. Maybe if you did not settle for being a glorified paper pusher, you would not be driving that absolute beater." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my career. I simply reached into my designer handbag, pulled out my key fob, and pressed the button. The headlights of the custom matte black Mercedes G-Wagon, parked directly behind his leased Porsche, flashed to life. The engine let out a low, predatory growl that made my brother drop his wine glass. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the scapegoat in your family only to quietly build an empire they knew nothing about. My name is Claire and I am 34 years old. Growing up in an affluent suburb outside of Chicago meant that appearances were everything to my parents. Our sprawling Tudor-style home with its perfectly manicured lawn and grand arched doorways was nothing more than a stage for my parents to show off their prized possession, my younger brother Brandon. At 32, Brandon was the undisputed golden child. He was loud, superficially charming, and possessed a deeply ingrained sense of entitlement that my parents nurtured like a rare orchid. My father, Richard, was a senior corporate executive who viewed child-rearing as a competition, and in his eyes, Brandon was the only champion. My mother, Susan, was a socialite whose entire identity revolved around her country club status and her son's supposed brilliance. I was always the afterthought, the daughter who was too quiet, too studious, and entirely too independent for their liking. While they happily funded Brandon's lavish lifestyle, his expensive Ivy League education, and his endless string of failed business ventures, I was expected to fade into the background. When I was 18, my father demanded I drain my modest college savings to help cover the settlement for a drunk driving incident Brandon had caused. When I flatly refused, my father cut me off completely. I paid my own way through a state university by working double shifts at a local diner. When I graduated with top honors in finance, my parents barely even glanced at my degree. They were too busy planning a massive celebration for Brandon because he had managed to secure a low-level internship through my father's golf course connections. I learned very early on that fighting for their validation was a completely losing game. So I simply stopped playing. I moved out, kept my head down, and worked harder than anyone else in my firm. Over the past decade, I climbed the brutal male-dominated corporate ladder of private equity. Today, I am a managing director at one of the most ruthless and successful financial firms on the West Coast. I negotiate multi-million-dollar corporate buyouts before my parents even finished their morning coffee. But to them, I was just Claire, the boring administrative assistant they assumed I still was. I never corrected them. The less they knew about my wealth, the safer it was. Which brings me to last Sunday. It was my mother's 60th birthday, and attendance at the family estate was mandatory. I arrived wearing a simple, understated cashmere sweater, deliberately parking my old reliable sedan down the street to avoid their usual comments. The afternoon began exactly as I expected. We were seated on the expensive teak furniture on their expansive back patio, surrounded by catered food. I knew my parents had put on a high-interest credit card. Brandon was holding court. He had recently launched another tech startup, one that supposedly revolutionized social media algorithms. He spent the first 2 hours loudly bragging about his projected profits and his new wife, Jasmine. Jasmine was a sharp, stunning African-American woman who came from a highly educated family. She sat beside Brandon, sipping her mimosa and smiling politely, though her observant eyes missed nothing. I always sensed she was far more calculating and pragmatic than she let on, choosing to play the supportive wife while carefully protecting her own interests. Brandon's favorite topic of the day, however, was his new car, a slate gray Porsche. He made sure to tell everyone within earshot that it was a symbol of his massive entrepreneurial success. He conveniently omitted the fact that it was heavily leased, a financial detail I had easily verified through my own industry contacts just days prior. My father was eating up every word. He clapped Brandon on the shoulder proudly, declaring that true business acumen ran deep in the family bloodline. Then, right on schedule, their attention turned to me, their favorite target. My mother sighed dramatically, looking at my plain outfit with profound disappointment. She told me I really needed to show more ambition, warning me that a woman my age, without a wealthy husband or a high-paying career, was a tragedy. She said it was a terrible shame I did not have Brandon's aggressive drive. That was when my father delivered his opening insult about my car, mocking the fact that I supposedly could not afford anything better than a used sedan. And then came Brandon's smug, arrogant declaration that I was just a glorified paper pusher who would never be on his level. The sheer audacity in his voice was the final push I needed. I was completely exhausted from shrinking myself to make their fragile egos comfortable. I looked at Brandon, his chest puffed out with unearned pride, and then I looked at my father, who was practically glowing with admiration for a son who was secretly drowning in massive corporate debt. I did not feel angry or hurt. I felt absolute icy clarity. I reached into my bag, wrapped my fingers around the heavy key fob, and pressed the ignition button. The sound of the G-Wagon engine roaring to life in the driveway shattered the quiet suburban afternoon. The heavy, muscular hum of the $250,000 custom vehicle was absolutely unmistakable. Everyone at the table froze. Brandon's smug smile melted off his face instantly. He slowly turned his head toward the driveway. The matte black beast was parked perfectly behind his leased sports car, its aggressive stance making the Porsche look like a cheap toy. The color rapidly drained from my father's cheeks. He looked from the window back to me, his mouth opening and closing in stunned silence. My mother dropped her silver fork onto her porcelain plate with a loud clatter. Jasmine set her mimosa down on the glass table, her eyebrows raised in genuine shock as she mentally calculated the astronomical cost of the vehicle sitting on the pavement. I picked up my crystal water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and offered my brother a perfectly calm smile. I told him he was absolutely right. I was not on his level at all. And if he was lucky, maybe one day he could afford to be on mine. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound on that patio was the low, aggressive rumble of my car engine. Then the illusion shattered. My father slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the expensive china. He stood up, his face flushed with sudden anger, and pointed a shaking finger at me. He demanded to know what kind of sick joke I was playing. He practically spit the words out, accusing me of going on a rental app and securing a luxury vehicle for the afternoon just to ruin my brother's special day. Brandon immediately grabbed onto that lifeline. The color rushed back to his face as he laughed, though it sounded incredibly forced and nervous. He shook his head, looking around the table to make sure everyone was buying his narrative. He told our parents that it was obvious I had rented it. He said I was probably desperate for attention because I was still single at 34 and stuck in a dead-end corporate job. He claimed it was pathetic that I would spend my meager savings just to steal his thunder. My mother chimed in right on cue, pressing her hand to her chest. She told me I was acting completely unhinged and that I needed to return the rental immediately before I damaged it and ruined my credit score. Then Jasmine spoke up. She set down her mimosa, leaning forward with a look of extreme manufactured pity. She used that soft, condescending tone people reserve for unruly children. She told me there was absolutely no shame in living within my means. She said it was dangerous for someone in my financial bracket to go into massive credit card debt just to keep up with her husband's wealth. She actually reached across the table and patted my hand, advising me to return the car and focus on finding a nice middle-class husband who could take care of me. I let them talk. I let them build their little fortress of denial layer by layer, watching them desperately try to protect the fragile reality where Brandon was a king and I was a peasant. I did not raise my voice to interrupt them. I simply stood up from my chair, smoothed out my cashmere sweater, and walked down the patio steps toward the driveway. My father yelled after me, demanding to know where I was going and ordering me to sit back down and apologize to my brother. I ignored him. I walked up to the custom vehicle, opened the heavy vault-like driver's side door, and reached into the glove compartment. I pulled out a crisp manila envelope, closed the door with a solid thud, and walked right back to the patio table. I dropped the envelope directly in front of my father. I told him to open it. Richard scoffed, crossing his arms and refusing to touch it, claiming he did not have time for my childish games. But Brandon could not resist. His anxiety was getting the better of him. He snatched the envelope off the table and ripped it open. He pulled out the official state vehicle registration and the original title document. I watched Brandon's eyes scan the paperwork. I watched his pupils dilate as he read the name printed clearly on the owner line, Claire. And right below that, the section indicating lien holders was completely blank. The car was not financed. It was not leased. It was paid in full in cash. Brandon's hands actually started to shake. He dropped the papers onto the glass table like they were on fire. My father leaned over to read them, his eyes widening in absolute disbelief. He looked up at me, his voice barely a whisper, asking how I could possibly afford a $250,000 vehicle. He demanded to know whose money I was spending. I leaned down, resting my hands on the back of my chair, and looked my father dead in the eye. I told him I earned every single penny of it, which was more than his golden boy could say about his leased sports car. Brandon completely lost his temper. His ego was hemorrhaging in front of his new wife and his parents. He slammed his hands on the table and stood up, towering over me, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me the way he did when we were teenagers. He shouted that a piece of paper did not prove anything. He told the entire family that I was probably living in a roach-infested studio apartment in the worst part of the city, eating ramen noodles every night just to afford the insurance on the car. He said I was a fraud putting on a show. He was so desperate to prove I was beneath him that he made the biggest mistake of his life. He pointed a finger in my face and challenged me. He said that if I was so rich and successful, I should host the entire family for Thanksgiving dinner next week. He said they all wanted to see this luxurious lifestyle of mine in person. He smirked fully, believing he had backed me into a corner I could not escape. He told my parents we would all go to my place for the holiday, expecting me to back down, apologize, and admit defeat. I did not back down. I looked at Brandon, then at Jasmine, whose eyes were still fixed on the paid-off vehicle title resting on the table. I gave them a bright, cheerful smile that did not reach my eyes. I told Brandon it was a fantastic idea. I told him I would text him the address, and that they should all dress nicely because my neighborhood had very strict standards. I picked up my handbag, turned my back on my stunned family, and walked to my car. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away, leaving them standing in the driveway, completely unaware that they had just walked right into my trap. The following Thursday morning arrived with crisp autumn air and clear blue skies. It was Thanksgiving Day, and I was standing in the massive gourmet kitchen of my custom-built home, sipping a mug of dark roast coffee. The house was a modern architectural masterpiece, tucked away in an ultra-exclusive private gated community in the hills. Floor-to-ceiling glass panels offered an unobstructed view of the private infinity pool and the sprawling valley below. I had purchased the $4.5 million estate 2 years ago entirely in cash, using the massive performance bonuses I had earned from tearing down and liquidating failing tech companies just like the one my brother claimed to run. I checked my watch. They were scheduled to arrive in exactly 30 minutes. I knew exactly what was happening in their cars right at that moment. My parents and Brandon were likely driving in a caravan following the GPS coordinates I had texted them the night before. Because the address was hidden deep in the hills, they had undoubtedly convinced themselves they were heading to a dangerous, rundown neighborhood. I could picture my mother clutching her purse, locking the doors, and complaining about the surroundings. I could picture Brandon laughing with Jasmine, assuring her that my facade was about to crumble. They thought they were coming to expose my failures. They had absolutely no idea they were driving straight into a financial execution. I set my coffee mug down on the imported Italian marble countertop and walked over to the security monitor mounted on the wall. The camera feed showed the heavy wrought iron gates at the entrance of my neighborhood. I watched patiently, waiting for Brandon's leased Porsche to appear on the screen. Right on time, the slate gray Porsche pulled up to the massive iron security gates. The camera feed showed Brandon rolling down his window, looking confused as the uniformed security guard stepped out of the booth. I watched my brother wave his hands in frustration, clearly arguing that the GPS had made a mistake and led them to the wrong area. A moment later, my wall panel chimed. The guard informed me that Brandon and Richard were at the gate claiming to know me but insisting they had the wrong address. I smiled and told the guard they were in the right place and to let them through. The heavy iron gates slowly swung open. I watched the Porsche, followed closely by my parents' luxury sedan, slowly creep up the winding palm tree-lined road. I knew exactly what they were seeing. Massive sprawling estates, manicured hedges, and luxury cars parked in expansive driveways. This was a neighborhood where tech billionaires and hedge fund managers lived, not glorified paper pushers. I walked to the front entrance and waited. Outside, I heard the crunch of tires on my circular cobblestone driveway. Then I heard the engines cut off. I waited another full minute, letting the sheer scale of the property sink in, before I reached out and pulled open the solid oak double doors. My family was standing perfectly still in the driveway. My father was staring up at the modern architectural masterpiece with his mouth slightly open. The house featured soaring roof lines, enormous imported stone pillars, and walls of tinted glass that reflected the morning sun. My mother had one hand clutching her designer purse and the other hovering near her chest as if she had forgotten how to breathe. Brandon was staring at the four-car garage. Through the glass garage doors, he could clearly see my custom G-Wagon parked comfortably next to a vintage, perfectly restored Porsche 911, a real one, not a lease. Jasmine was the only one who noticed me standing in the doorway. She nudged Brandon sharply in the ribs, breaking his trance. I stepped out onto the granite porch and casually welcomed them to my home. I told them to come inside because the private chef I hired was already preparing the appetizers. None of them said a word as they walked up the steps and crossed the threshold. The grand foyer featured 30-foot vaulted ceilings, a floating glass staircase, and an unobstructed view straight through the living room to the backyard, where the infinity pool seemed to spill over the edge of the cliff. The silence was deafening. Every step they took echoed off the polished marble floors. My mother desperately tried to regain some sense of superiority. She ran her hand along the imported stone island in the kitchen and sniffed softly. She told me the house was certainly large, but felt incredibly cold and devoid of personality. She said it felt more like a corporate retreat than a family home. I simply thanked her for the feedback and offered her a glass of $500 vintage wine. She took it without hesitation. We moved to the formal dining room where my chef served a flawless 5-course holiday meal. For the first 20 minutes, the only sound was the clinking of silverware against porcelain. Brandon was practically vibrating with nervous energy while Jasmine meticulously analyzed every expensive detail of the room. Then the inevitable shift happened. My family realized that mocking my supposed poverty was no longer an option, so they instantly pivoted to the next best strategy. They tried to claim ownership of my success. My father stood up at the head of the table holding his wine glass high. He cleared his throat and put on his best authoritative voice. He looked around the dining room and announced that he was incredibly proud. He told the table that he always knew his tough love approach would eventually push me to succeed. He actually had the audacity to claim that cutting me off at 18 and forcing me to struggle was a calculated parenting decision designed to build my character. He did not stop there. He took a sip of his wine and casually dictated that this house was absolutely perfect for hosting all future family holidays. He then looked at Brandon and smiled, telling my brother that he should bring his startup investors here for dinners to show them how successful the family was. My father was effortlessly volunteering my home, my money, and my achievements to elevate his golden child. I set my fork down on my plate. I wiped my mouth with the linen napkin and leaned back in my chair. I looked directly at my father and shattered his delusion completely. I told him I was not hosting anything. I told him that after they finished their dessert, none of them were ever invited back onto my property. The dining room erupted. My mother gasped, spilling her wine onto the table. My father turned bright red, slamming his glass down and demanding to know how I could be so ungrateful after everything they had supposedly done for me. But it was Brandon who completely lost his mind. The humiliation of sitting in my multi-million-dollar house while his own company was drowning in debt finally broke him. He jumped out of his chair, pointing a shaking finger at me across the table. He screamed that there was no possible way I earned this money legitimately. He told the entire room that I must have stolen it. He accused me of embezzling from our late grandfather's estate. The very same trust fund that my father claimed had gone bankrupt 3 years ago. Brandon shouted that I had robbed him of his rightful inheritance and used his money to buy this house. He looked at my parents and declared that they needed to call the police immediately and have me audited. Jasmine stood up, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She glared at me with absolute venom. She told me that if I stole money from her husband, they were going to take this house from me. She said they had a baby on the way, and she would not let me rob her child of what was rightfully theirs. I let them scream. I let the threats echo off the vaulted ceilings. Then I slowly stood up from the table. I did not raise my voice. I simply told them to wait right there. I turned my back on them and walked down the hallway to my home office, leaving them completely unaware of the trap door I was about to open. I closed the heavy, solid wood door of my home office and let the sound of my family shouting in the dining room fade into a muffled buzz. I did not rush. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the valley. Standing there, I allowed myself a moment to reflect on exactly how we had reached this boiling point. My mind drifted back to a conversation from 16 years ago, the defining moment that had permanently severed my emotional ties to my parents and set the stage for everything happening today. I was 18 years old and had just received my acceptance letter to a prestigious out-of-state university. I had spent 4 years working part-time jobs to build up a modest college savings account because my father had made it very clear that his financial priority was Brandon's Ivy League tuition. Brandon was 20 at the time and already failing his sophomore year. He was spending his weekends partying on my father's dime. That spring, Brandon made the brilliant decision to drive his sports car through the front window of a local bakery while heavily intoxicated. The property damage and the subsequent legal fees were astronomical. The bakery owners threatened a massive lawsuit that could have ruined my father's corporate reputation. My father did what he always did. He threw money at the problem to protect his golden child. But he did not want to liquidate his own stock options. Instead, he called me into his study and demanded that I hand over my entire college savings to help cover the out-of-court settlement. He also demanded that I co-sign a high-interest personal loan to make up the difference. He told me it was my duty as a sister to protect the family name. When I looked him in the eye and flatly refused, he was furious. He told me I was selfish and ungrateful. He officially cut me off that very afternoon, declaring that I would not receive a single dime of family money for the rest of my life. I smiled at the memory as I turned away from the window and walked toward my wall safe. Cutting me off was the greatest gift he could have ever given me. It forced me to become ruthless. It forced me to view the world through the cold, hard lens of leverage and liability. I punched the access code into the digital keypad, and the heavy steel door clicked open. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, bound manila folder. I ran my hand over the cover, thinking about how entirely predictable my family was. Even this morning, as I was prepping the turkey with my private chef, I knew exactly how today would play out. I knew they were driving up the winding mountain roads, fully expecting my GPS coordinates to lead them into a dangerous slum. They had spent the entire week mocking me, believing I was living in a roach-infested studio apartment. The absolute shock on their faces when my heavy iron gates opened to reveal this estate, was something I would cherish forever. But the fact that they immediately pivoted from mocking my poverty to plotting how they could steal my wealth was exactly why I had prepared this folder. I took a deep breath, feeling a surge of pure adrenaline. I unlocked the office door and walked back down the long corridor toward the formal dining room. The volume of their voices grew louder with every step. When I re-entered the room, the chaos was in full swing. My father was pacing back and forth near the imported stone fireplace, his phone already in his hand. He was loudly threatening to call his corporate lawyers first thing in the morning to file an emergency injunction against my assets. He pointed at me as I walked in, screaming that I had secretly drained my late grandfather's trust fund. He claimed that money was legally designated as seed capital for Brandon's startup company. My mother was sitting in her chair, dabbing at her dry eyes with a linen napkin, playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch. She wailed about how she had raised a thief and asked how I could possibly betray my own flesh and blood. Jasmine was standing right next to Brandon, her arms crossed defensively over her chest. She looked at me with a mix of disgust and entitlement. She told me I was going to pay for what I had done. She said her husband was a brilliant entrepreneur who deserved that money, and that I was nothing but a jealous administrative assistant who had to resort to grand larceny to afford a nice house. I did not interrupt them. I walked calmly to the head of the long dining table. I took the thick manila folder and dropped it directly onto the polished mahogany surface. The heavy slap of the paper against the wood echoed through the room, instantly silencing their shouts. I looked at Jasmine first. I told her she was absolutely right about one thing. This house was incredibly expensive. But I assured her I did not need to steal a single penny to afford it. I opened the folder and pulled out the first document. It was a printed copy of my corporate profile from my firm. I slid it across the table toward my father. I told them I was not a paper pusher. I informed them that for the past 5 years, I had been a managing director at one of the most aggressive private equity firms in the country. I told them my annual performance bonus alone was more than Brandon's fake tech company had ever generated in gross revenue. My father stopped pacing. He stared at the corporate letterhead, his eyes darting back and forth as he read my official title and the details of the multi-million-dollar funds I personally managed. The color began to drain from his face once again. But that was just the appetizer. I reached back into the folder and pulled out the main course, a 50-page forensic financial audit. I slid it straight down the center of the table until it rested directly in front of Brandon and Jasmine. I looked at my brother, who was suddenly sweating profusely. I told the room that my grandfather's estate did not go bankrupt 3 years ago. I told them the trust fund was drained intentionally, and then I told them exactly who drained it. I looked directly at my father and then at my brother. I told the room that over the past 36 months, Richard had authorized 47 separate wire transfers from my grandfather's trust account. I explained that the money was moved directly into a shell corporation registered under Brandon's name. The total amount stolen from the estate was just over $1.2 million. I did not stop there. I looked at Jasmine and told her that Brandon did not use a single cent of that money for his supposed revolutionary tech startup. I explained that my team of forensic accountants had traced the funds perfectly. Brandon used the stolen inheritance to cover massive offshore gambling debts. He had been accumulating these debts for years during his frequent business trips to the Bahamas and Las Vegas. I laid out the exact dates, the transfer amounts, and the corresponding casino receipts that were all fully documented in the folder sitting in front of them. Susan gasped loudly. She dropped her linen napkin and stared at Richard as if he were a complete stranger. She asked him with a trembling voice if it was true. She asked how he could steal from her own father's estate just to cover up Brandon's failures. Richard could not even look his wife in the eye. He stared down at the polished mahogany table, his jaw completely clenched and his knuckles turning stark white as he gripped the edge of the wood. His authoritative facade had entirely crumbled in a matter of seconds. Jasmine, however, did not gasp and she did not cry. She was far too pragmatic for tears. She immediately reached out and grabbed the thick financial audit. Her eyes rapidly scanned the highlighted columns of numbers and the bank transfer records. It only took her a few moments to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the financial ruin sitting right in front of her. I watched the realization wash over her face. She realized in real time that her lavish lifestyle, her designer wardrobe, and the beautiful nursery she was building for her unborn child were all funded by stolen money and a mountain of hidden debt. Richard finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. Panic took over. He lunged across the dining table, knocking over a crystal water glass in an attempt to snatch the audit papers out of Jasmine's hands. He yelled at me that these were private family matters and that I had absolutely no legal right to investigate his personal finances. He demanded that I hand over all copies of the documents immediately. I simply took a step back and smiled coldly. I told my father he was far too late. I informed him that I had already emailed secure encrypted copies of the entire forensic audit to my personal legal team, the state tax board, and the original legal executor of my grandfather's estate. I told him there was no sweeping this under the rug. Brandon started to panic openly. The room was closing in on him, and he began sweating profusely. He tried to force a laugh, but it sounded like a choke. He looked at Jasmine and started stuttering out desperate excuses. He swore to his wife that it was just a temporary bridge loan to keep the company afloat during a rough quarter. He promised her that his tech startup was on the verge of a massive multi-million-dollar breakthrough. He frantically explained that his main private equity investor was scheduled to wire him $3 million first thing Monday morning. He claimed this massive capital injection would take his company public and allow him to silently pay back the trust fund before the authorities ever got involved. I let him dig his hole just a little bit deeper. Then I told Jasmine to turn to page 42 of the folder. Jasmine ignored Brandon's rambling and flipped through the heavy pages of the audit. I watched her perfectly manicured finger trace the text of a secondary legal document I had included in the report. It was the title deed and the current mortgage agreement for the luxury starter home she and Brandon shared. I calmly pointed out the third mortgage loan that had been taken out just 6 months prior. Jasmine stared at the paper, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She whispered that they only had one mortgage. She stated clearly that she had never signed any paperwork for a third loan against their property. I nodded slowly. I told her I knew she had not signed it. I explained that when Brandon exhausted the stolen trust fund money, he still needed capital to keep his fake entrepreneur lifestyle afloat. So he forged her signature on the legal documents to leverage the very last asset they had to their names. He had secretly bet their family home on another failing business venture. The dining room fell into a terrifying dead silence. Jasmine slowly let go of the folder. The heavy pages slapped against the table. She turned her head to look at Brandon and her voice dropped to a deadly quiet whisper. She demanded to know if he had forged her name on a legal banking document. Brandon turned completely pale. He reached out, trying to grab her hands, begging her to listen to him. He swore on his life that the $3 million shadow investor on Monday was going to fix every single mistake he had made. He pleaded with her, telling her they were going to be richer than they ever imagined. Jasmine violently shoved his hands away. She pushed her heavy dining chair back so hard it nearly tipped over. She stood up, creating a physical barrier between herself and the man she had married. Susan began weeping hysterically, begging the two men to explain how they could destroy the family like this. The perfect, wealthy image they had spent decades maintaining was tearing itself to shreds right in the middle of my dining room, and I did not have to lift a finger to help them do it. Brandon's voice cracked as he yelled at the room to calm down. He pointed at me and screamed that I was trying to ruin his life out of pure jealousy. He shouted that once his investor wired the $3 million on Monday, he was going to buy my entire neighborhood just to bulldoze my house. He stood there trembling, holding on to the imaginary lifeline of this mysterious private equity savior. I took a slow sip of my water. I set the crystal glass down on the table and looked my brother dead in the eye. I told him we needed to have a very serious conversation about that investor. My private chef seamlessly transitioned us from the grand foyer into the formal dining room. The space was designed to intimidate. A massive custom mahogany table sat under a cascading crystal chandelier with floor-to-ceiling glass doors completely pushed back to let the crisp autumn evening breeze roll in from the canyon. The table was set with imported Italian porcelain and heavy silver cutlery. It was a far cry from the plastic plates and cramped studio apartment they had spent the entire week mocking me over. We took our seats. I sat at the head of the table, a position my father instinctively walked toward before realizing it was my house, and he was merely a guest. He settled into the chair to my right, looking visibly uncomfortable with the shift in power. For the first 20 minutes, the only sound in the massive room was the gentle clinking of silverware and the soft jazz playing through the hidden surround sound system. My mother, Susan, was the first one to break the silence. She could not handle the cognitive dissonance. She took a delicate sip of her wine and looked at me with a strained, forced smile. She asked me how a mid-level administrative assistant could possibly secure the financing for a property like this. She suggested that perhaps I had found a wealthy older man to co-sign the mortgage for me. She was desperately searching for any explanation that kept her worldview intact. An explanation where I was still dependent and inferior. I did not take the bait. I simply smiled and told her there was no mortgage and there was no man. I told her I bought the estate entirely in cash 2 years ago. That statement hung in the air like a physical weight. I watched the reality finally crush their delusions. Jasmine stopped cutting her food. She looked around the room, her eyes doing the frantic mental math of what a property in this zip code actually cost. She looked at the expensive art on the walls, the custom furniture, and the flawless landscaping. I could see the exact moment the entitlement shifted inside her head, the moment she stopped looking at my home as a threat and started looking at it as an asset she could somehow claim. Brandon was coping the only way he knew how. He was drinking heavily. He poured himself a third glass of the $500 vintage red wine I had provided, completely ignoring the fact that just 2 hours earlier he had called me a paper pusher who was not on his level. Now, he was sitting in my house drinking my wine and looking around with a greedy, possessive glint in his eye. But it was my father, Richard, who executed the most breathtaking display of mental gymnastics. He had spent my entire life treating me like a disappointment. He had cut off my college fund, kicked me out of the house, and spent the last decade praising Brandon's fake entrepreneurial success while ignoring my existence. But now, faced with undeniable proof of my massive wealth, he instantly pivoted. Richard pushed his chair back and stood up. He picked up his crystal wineglass and tapped it lightly with his silver knife to command the attention of the room. He stood tall, puffing out his chest, sliding right back into the role of the authoritative family patriarch. He looked down the length of the table at me with a wide, beaming smile that made my stomach turn. He announced to the table that he wanted to propose a toast to his daughter. He said he was looking around this incredible home and feeling an overwhelming sense of pride. But then he took it a step further. He boldly claimed that he always knew I had this level of success in me. He looked at Susan and Brandon and told them that his tough love approach had clearly worked. My father stood in my dining room and had the absolute audacity to take credit for the empire I built. He claimed that cutting me off at 18, refusing to pay for my college and forcing me to struggle was all part of a grand, calculated parenting strategy. He said he knew I needed to be pushed out of the nest so I could learn to fly. He raised his glass to me and said he was glad I finally understood why he had to be so hard on me. I sat perfectly still, my face completely unreadable. I let him talk. I wanted him to put all of his cards on the table. Emboldened by his own speech and my silence, Richard decided it was time to establish his dominance over my assets. He took a sip of the expensive wine and casually dictated the new family dynamic. He announced that because my house was so spacious and secure, it would become the official venue for all future family gatherings. He told my mother she would not have to worry about cooking for Christmas or Easter anymore, because I would be hosting everyone here from now on. Then he turned his attention to his golden child. He looked at Brandon, who was nodding along eagerly. Richard told my brother that this estate was the perfect backdrop for his startup company. He suggested that Brandon should start using my formal living room and my outdoor entertainment area to host his tech investors. He said pitching in a $4 million house would give Brandon's company the prestige it needed to secure massive funding rounds. Richard actually looked at me and told me to give Brandon a spare set of keys before they left so he could bring his business partners over whenever he needed to. They had seamlessly transitioned from completely discarding me to completely consuming me. In their minds, my money, my home, and my success were simply extensions of the family wealth. Wealth they felt fully entitled to manage and spend. They expected me to fall right back into line, serving as the quiet, accommodating sister who would gladly hand over the keys to her kingdom just to finally earn their approval. My father finished his toast by asking everyone to raise their glasses to family and to the bright future we were all going to share together. Brandon, Jasmine, and Susan all raised their glasses, beaming with greedy anticipation. I did not touch my glass. I let the silence stretch out for a long, uncomfortable moment. I waited until my father slowly lowered his arm, his confident smile faltering slightly under my cold gaze. Then I leaned forward, rested my arms on the mahogany table, and prepared to tear their perfect new fantasy to absolute shreds. I looked at my father as he stood there holding his $500 glass of wine, expecting me to thank him for his years of emotional abuse. I did not blink. I told him his toast was entirely based on a massive delusion. I explained that I did not succeed because of his tough love. I succeeded in spite of him. I told him he did not build my character, he simply revealed his own lack of one. I calmly set down my fork on the imported Italian porcelain plate. The clink of the heavy silver echoed loudly in the sudden quiet of the dining room. I looked around the large mahogany table, making direct eye contact with every single one of them. I shattered their fantasy with one sentence. I told them I was not hosting anything. Not Thanksgiving, not Christmas, and certainly not Brandon's fake tech investors. I informed them that the only reason they were invited here today was so they could finally see exactly what I had built without their help. I finished by stating clearly that after they finished their dessert, none of them were ever allowed to set foot on my property again. The dining room absolutely erupted. My mother dropped her wine glass. The deep vintage red liquid spilled across the pristine white linen tablecloth like a bloodstain. She grabbed her chest, acting as if she were having a sudden heart attack. She wailed about how ungrateful I was, and how she could not believe I would treat my own flesh and blood with such sheer cruelty after everything they had done to raise me. My father turned a shade of deep, furious purple. He slammed his wine glass down on the table so hard I was surprised the delicate crystal did not shatter into pieces. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his voice booming with the authoritative rage he always used to keep me in line when I was a teenager. He demanded that I apologize immediately. He told me I was acting like a spoiled brat, and that I had absolutely no right to speak to the family patriarch in that tone. He shouted that buying a nice house did not give me the right to disrespect the people who gave me life. I sat perfectly still, letting his anger wash over me without reacting. My absolute unbothered calm only infuriated them more. But it was Brandon who completely unraveled. The sheer humiliation of sitting in my $4.5 million dining room while his own leased life was secretly falling apart finally broke his fragile ego. He pushed his heavy dining chair back and jumped to his feet. His face was slick with nervous sweat, and his eyes were completely wild. He could not process the reality that his sister, the person he had belittled his entire life, was vastly more successful than he would ever be. Since his arrogant brain could not accept that I had earned this wealth legitimately, he immediately invented a narrative where I was a criminal. Brandon pointed across the table, his hand trembling with desperate rage. He screamed that there was no way a glorified paper pusher like me could afford an estate like this. He told the entire room that my money had to be dirty. He shouted that he finally figured out how I bought the house and the luxury cars. He accused me of embezzlement. Brandon looked at my parents and declared that I must have stolen the money from our late grandfather's estate. Grandfather Theodore had passed away 3 years ago, leaving behind a substantial trust fund that was supposedly meant to be divided among the family. But shortly after his death, my father had solemnly gathered us together and claimed that the trust was entirely bankrupt due to a series of bad real estate investments. Richard had told us there was nothing left to inherit and the accounts were closed. Now Brandon was weaponizing that memory. He shouted that I must have discovered a hidden offshore account or forged legal documents to drain the estate before anyone else could find it. He accused me of robbing him of his rightful inheritance. He screamed that the money I used to buy this house was supposed to be the seed capital for his tech startup. He painted himself as the innocent victim of my grand larceny. He looked at our father and demanded that he call the police immediately. He insisted they hire forensic accountants and corporate lawyers to freeze my assets and drag me into federal court. He promised Jasmine that they were going to sue me for every single penny I was worth and take the house right out from under me. Jasmine immediately took his side, sensing an opportunity to secure her own financial future. She stood up, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She glared at me with absolute venom, her eyes flashing with greedy entitlement. She told me that if I stole money from her husband, I was going to pay dearly. She reminded the room that she had a baby on the way, and she flatly refused to let a jealous spinster aunt rob her unborn child of its rightful legacy. She told me she would personally see to it that I went to prison. The screaming continued echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of my beautiful home. They were a pack of wolves circling what they believed was wounded prey. They felt completely justified in their righteous anger, fully convinced that they had just uncovered my dark secret and regained the upper hand. I let them scream. I let them hurl their empty threats of police and lawsuits and extensive audits. I let them dig their trap as deep as they possibly could. I even watched my father pull out his cell phone, actually pretending he was about to call his legal team. When they finally started to run out of breath, I slowly stood up from the head of the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself against their wild accusations. I simply looked at Brandon and told him to wait right there. I turned my back on them and walked out of the dining room, heading straight down the long tiled hallway toward my locked home office, leaving them completely unaware of the absolute destruction I was about to unleash. As I walked down the long, wide corridor of my home, the sound of their outrage followed me. The heavy oak floors absorbed my footsteps, but the sheer volume of my father's voice echoed off the high ceiling. I could hear Richard immediately taking control of the narrative in the dining room. He was aggressively backing Brandon up, just like he had done for my entire life. He was loudly promising my brother that he would hire the most vicious corporate litigators in the state to freeze my bank accounts by tomorrow morning. He was telling Brandon not to worry, assuring him that they would uncover whatever fraudulent scheme I had used to steal the grandfather's estate money. I reached the heavy double doors of my home office. I pressed my thumb against the biometric lock and the doors clicked open. The room was dark except for the moonlight spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the canyon. I walked over to the hidden steel safe built directly into the custom wood paneling behind my desk. I punched in the 6-digit code. The heavy metal door swung open. Inside, sitting perfectly centered on the steel shelf, was a thick bound manila folder. I reached out and picked it up, feeling the substantial weight of the paper in my hands. This folder contained my entire life. It held the absolute truth about who I was, what I did for a living, and exactly how my family had funded their pathetic illusions. I took a deep breath. I did not feel anxious. I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. I closed the safe and walked back out into the hallway, carrying the heavy folder against my side. By the time I reached the entrance of the formal dining room, the chaos had reached a fever pitch. Richard was pacing back and forth at the head of the table, his face dark red with fury. The moment he saw me step back into the room, he launched his legal threats directly at my face. He pointed a finger at me, screaming that I had made the biggest mistake of my life by trying to outsmart him. He told me he was going to have me audited by the federal government. He shouted that embezzling from a family trust was a serious felony and that he would personally ensure I spent the next decade in federal prison for stealing Brandon's rightful inheritance. He promised me that by the time his lawyers were finished tearing through my life, I would not even be able to afford the roach-infested apartment they originally thought I lived in. Brandon sat in his chair, nodding along with a smug, vindictive look on his face. He was completely hiding behind our father, letting Richard fight his battles just like he did when he crashed his car at 20 years old. My mother, Susan, was putting on an award-winning theatrical performance. She was clutching a linen napkin to her chest, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face. She looked at me with an expression of profound disgust and heartbreak. She asked me how I could possibly betray the family like this. She wailed that she had welcomed me into her home for her birthday just last week, unaware that she was breaking bread with a thief. She told the room that she was completely traumatized by my cruelty, and that my actions were going to send her to an early grave. She completely ignored the fact that just 20 minutes ago she was happily volunteering my home to host her future country club parties. Then Jasmine decided it was her turn to attack. She pushed her chair back violently and stood up. She slammed both of her hands flat onto the mahogany dining table, leaning forward to glare at me with absolute venom. The polite, condescending mask she had worn all week was completely gone, replaced by raw, aggressive entitlement. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. Her voice was sharp and loud, cutting through my parents' dramatic sobbing. She told me that if I stole a single dime from her husband, I was going to pay for it with everything I owned. She looked around my beautiful dining room and declared that they were taking this house from me. She shouted that she had a baby on the way, and she would absolutely not let a jealous, bitter woman rob her child of its future. She told me that Brandon was a brilliant entrepreneur who was meant to change the world, and that I was nothing but a criminal who had sabotaged his success out of pure spite. She promised me that she would not rest until I handed over the keys to the estate and walked out the front door with nothing. I walked slowly to the head of the table. I did not tell them to calm down. I did not try to defend my character or explain how hard I had worked to build my career. I simply stood there looking at the four of them. I looked at my father, who was practically vibrating with misplaced righteous anger. I looked at my mother, who was weaponizing her tears to manipulate the situation. I looked at my brother, who was drowning in secret debt, but pretending to be a victim. And I looked at Jasmine, who was fiercely defending a wealthy lifestyle that did not actually exist. I raised my hand and gently placed the thick manila folder directly onto the center of the mahogany table. The heavy slap of the paper against the wood made Jasmine flinch. I left my hand resting on top of the folder. I looked Jasmine dead in the eye and told her she was completely right about one thing. I told her someone in this room had definitely robbed her child of its future. But it was not me. I slowly pulled my hand back from the manila folder and flipped the heavy cover open. The room was so quiet, you could hear the soft rustle of the paper. I reached inside and pulled out a stack of documents printed on thick, embossed corporate letterhead. I looked at my brother and my parents, who were still staring at me with a mixture of hatred and confusion. I told them that for the past 16 years, they had built an entire mythology around my supposed failure. They had convinced themselves that because I did not brag loudly at family dinners or lease luxury cars I could not afford, I was somehow struggling to survive. I slid the first document across the polished mahogany table directly toward my father. I told him to look closely at the logo at the top of the page. Richard was a senior corporate executive. He spent his entire life worshiping the corporate hierarchy. I knew the moment he saw the name of the firm, his entire reality would fracture. He leaned forward, squinting at the paper. He read the words, Oakmont Capital Group aloud. His voice wavered immediately. Oakmont was one of the most aggressive and ruthlessly successful private equity firms on the entire West Coast. They were known for orchestrating multi-billion-dollar corporate buyouts, hostile takeovers, and massive liquidations. I told my father that he and Brandon had spent all week calling me a glorified paper pusher and a mid-level administrative assistant. I told them I never bothered to correct them because their ignorance was my greatest protection against their endless greed. I pointed to the second line of the document. I told Richard to read my official title. He stared at the paper, his jaw literally dropping. He choked on the words as he read them. Managing Director. I looked at Brandon, who was furiously shaking his head, refusing to accept the reality unfolding in front of him. I told my brother that I did not fetch coffee or file paperwork. I told him that I personally commanded a portfolio of distressed assets worth over $4 billion. I explained that while he was begging low-level angel investors for a few $1,000s to fund his imaginary social media apps, I was sitting in boardrooms, systematically dismantling and liquidating failing tech companies just like his. Susan blinked rapidly, her eyes darting between Richard and me. She did not understand the intricacies of private equity, but she understood the absolute shock radiating from her husband. She asked Richard what that meant. She asked him how much a person with that job title actually made. Before my father could answer, I slid a second document across the table. It was a certified copy of my tax return from the previous year. I pushed it right in front of my mother. I told her she did not need to guess. I told her to look at the bottom line. Susan looked down at the paper. Her perfectly manicured finger traced the ink across the page until she reached the final number. She let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hand. She looked up at me, as if she were staring at an alien. I told the room that my base salary was well into the 7 figures. But my annual performance bonus for closing a single corporate acquisition last year was over $6 million after taxes. I looked directly at Brandon, who had turned the color of chalk. I told him that I bought this $4.5 million house completely in cash using just a fraction of my yearly bonus. I told him that the custom Mercedes parked in the garage cost me less than what I make in a single week. Brandon slammed both of his hands onto the table. He shouted that it was impossible. He desperately claimed that I must have forged the documents on my computer to scare them. He yelled that women like me did not become managing directors at cutthroat financial firms without family connections or seed money. He told Jasmine not to believe a word I was saying, insisting it was an elaborate bluff to cover up the fact that I had emptied the grandfather's trust fund. I did not even blink at his outburst. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and tossed it onto the table. It slid across the smooth wood and stopped right in front of him. I told Brandon to open the web browser. I told him to search the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission database for my name. I told him he would find me listed on the board of directors for 3 different publicly traded corporations. I told him he could also pull up the Wall Street Journal archives from last month, where my firm had proudly announced my promotion to senior partner on the front page of the business section. Richard slowly sank back into his heavy dining chair. All the fight completely drained out of him. The authoritative patriarch who had threatened to send me to federal prison just 5 minutes ago was now staring at his daughter with a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He knew exactly how powerful Oakmont Capital was. He knew the kind of ruthless legal and financial resources a managing director at that firm possessed. He realized in that exact moment that he had brought a butter knife to a nuclear war. Jasmine was staring at the tax return resting near Susan. She was a smart woman, and the undeniable proof of my massive wealth was sinking in rapidly. Her anger was shifting. She was no longer looking at me like a criminal. She was looking at me like an undeniable force of nature. And more importantly, she was starting to wonder why I had brought up her child's stolen future if I was not the one who took the money. I let the absolute crushing weight of my success settle over them. I let them realize that the daughter they had discarded and the sister they had relentlessly mocked was actually a financial titan who could buy and sell their entire lives before lunch. Then I reached back into the manila folder. I told them that now that we had clearly established where my money came from, it was time to talk about where the grandfather's money actually went. I reached my hand back into the manila folder. My father was still staring at my certified tax return, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. Brandon was gripping the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. I pulled out the final document. It was not a few pages of corporate letterhead like the others. It was a thick, professionally bound book of financial records over 200 pages long. I did not hand it to my father. I did not hand it to my brother. I looked directly at the woman sitting across the table, who had just threatened to take my house. I slid the heavy book across the polished wood. It stopped exactly an inch from Jasmine's porcelain plate. I told Jasmine to go ahead and open it. I told her that since she was so fiercely protective of her unborn child's financial future, she deserved to know exactly who was destroying it. Jasmine looked at me. Her eyes narrowed with deep suspicion, but her pragmatic nature won. She reached out and flipped open the heavy cover. I addressed the room. I took them back 3 years ago to the day Grandfather Theodore died. I reminded them of the somber family meeting in my parents' living room, where my father, acting as the sole legal executor of the estate, handed us all a single sheet of paper. He had looked us in the eye and lied, claiming that the trust fund was completely bankrupt due to a series of disastrous commercial real estate investments. He had told us with a perfectly straight face that there was absolutely nothing left to inherit and that the accounts were closed. I told them that my grandfather was a brilliant man who never made a bad investment in his entire life. The trust was not empty when he died. I looked at my mother, Susan, and delivered the first crushing blow. I told her that her father's trust fund held exactly $3.2 million in fully liquid assets on the day he passed away. Susan let out a sharp, strangled gasp. She turned to Richard, her eyes wide with betrayal. She asked him if that was true. She asked him how he could possibly lie to her about her own father's money. Richard tried to stand up. He opened his mouth to shout, to issue another empty legal threat, but the words completely died in his throat. He looked at the thick forensic audit resting under Jasmine's hands and realized his absolute worst nightmare had come true. His secret was entirely exposed. He slumped back into his chair, a defeated, broken man. I told Jasmine to turn to page 14. I explained that I had hired one of the top forensic accounting firms in the country to trace every single penny of my grandfather's money. I told her the audit detailed exactly 72 separate wire transfers authorized by my father over the past 36 months. Every single transfer moved money out of the protected family trust and directly into a series of shell LLCs registered under Brandon's name. Brandon started shaking his head violently. He looked at Jasmine, his voice cracking as he begged her not to read it. He claimed it was seed capital. He swore to his wife that our father was just acting as an angel investor for his tech startup and that it was a legitimate business loan designed to keep the company afloat until their next funding round. I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed in the massive dining room. I told Brandon to stop insulting our intelligence. I told Jasmine to flip to the highlighted section on page 40. I explained that my corporate accountants did not just track the money going into Brandon's shell companies. They tracked exactly where the money went after he got his hands on it. I looked at my mother, who was sitting in completely stunned silence. I told her that her golden boy did not spend her father's money on server hosting software developers or marketing campaigns. He spent it in VIP high roller rooms. I laid out the absolute, undeniable truth. Brandon was not a tech visionary. He was a degenerate gambling addict who had racked up massive offshore debts playing high-stakes baccarat and placing illegal sports bets. I told the room that Brandon blew through the first $1 million in less than 8 months. When the offshore bookies started threatening him, he ran back to our father crying for help. And Richard, the man who refused to pay for my college education because of a teenage mistake, happily drained another $2 million from the family trust to save his precious son from the consequences of his own actions. Jasmine sat perfectly still. Her eyes rapidly scanned the bank statements, the wire transfer receipts, and the casino payout ledgers included in the audit. The numbers were undeniable. I watched her perfectly manicured fingers tremble slightly as she turned the pages. She was a highly educated woman, and she was doing the mental math in real time. She was calculating the massive burn rate of their lavish lifestyle. She realized in that exact moment that the designer clothes, the luxury vacations, the country club memberships, and the leased Porsche sitting in my driveway were not paid for by a successful tech company. Every single thing she owned was funded by stolen money. Brandon had been bleeding the trust fund dry to cover his gambling losses and to maintain a fake wealthy image to impress her and his friends. I looked at Brandon, who was sweating so profusely, his expensive designer shirt was clinging to his chest. He was hyperventilating, staring at the audit like it was a loaded weapon. I told him he had a massive amount of nerve sitting at my dining table and accusing me of embezzlement. I told him he was nothing but a thief dressed in a leased suit, and that his entire fake empire was built on the money he stole from his own family. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The entire power dynamic of my family had been completely obliterated in less than 10 minutes. But I was not finished. I watched Jasmine slowly look up from the audit, her eyes burning with a terrifying, calculating rage. I knew she was about to turn on him, but there was still one more secret in that folder she needed to see. The sharp crash of crystal shattering against my imported marble floor broke the suffocating silence. My mother had dropped her wine glass. She did not even look down as the expensive vintage red wine splattered across the pristine stone like a crime scene. Her eyes were locked entirely on my father. The theatrical tears she had been crying just moments ago were completely gone. They were replaced by a look of sheer unadulterated horror. She whispered, "My grandfather's name." Then her voice began to rise, cracking with a level of raw hysteria I had never heard from her before. She asked Richard how he could look her in the eye for 3 years, knowing he had robbed her own father blind. She reminded him that Grandpa Theodore had worked his entire life to build that wealth, and Richard had simply handed it over to a casino to protect a degenerate. Richard held up his hands, palms facing outward, in a desperate attempt to pacify her. He used his calm, corporate negotiation voice, begging Susan to lower her volume. He told her she did not understand the pressure he was under. He claimed that the people Brandon owed money to were not the kind of people you could negotiate with. He admitted, right there in front of everyone, that he had to drain the trust fund to keep his son out of prison, or worse. That admission was the fatal blow to their marriage. Susan lunged forward and slapped Richard across the face. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the massive dining room. Richard stumbled back, holding his cheek, completely stunned. Susan screamed that he had sacrificed their entire family legacy for a son who was nothing but a complete and utter failure. At the other end of the table, Jasmine was entirely ignoring the physical altercation between my parents. Her focus was locked on the thick forensic audit. Her eyes darted back and forth across the pages, scanning the highlighted bank transfers and the horrifying lists of liabilities. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling as the full picture of her fake life came into sharp focus. She looked up from the book and stared at Brandon. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of a woman who had just realized she was trapped in a burning building. She asked him a very simple question. She asked him how much money they actually had in their personal bank accounts right at this exact moment. Brandon tried to lie. He instinctively reached for his usual arrogant charm. He stammered, trying to force a reassuring smile, telling Jasmine that she was overreacting. He told her that his business accounts were just temporarily restricted, and that they still had plenty of liquid cash to cover their lifestyle. Jasmine picked up her heavy silver dinner fork and slammed it down onto the mahogany table with incredible force. She ordered him to stop lying to her. She pointed at the audit and recited the numbers directly from my accountants. She told him that according to the financial records, their joint checking account was overdrawn. She told him the credit cards used to buy her designer maternity clothes were completely maxed out. She demanded to know how he planned to pay for the hospital bill when she gave birth. Brandon shrank back into his chair, looking like a terrified child. He looked toward our father, expecting Richard to swoop in and save him, just like he always did. But Richard was too busy defending himself against Susan, who was currently demanding a full accounting of their own retirement funds, suspecting he had drained those as well. Jasmine saw Brandon look away, and she completely snapped. The alliance between the antagonists violently fractured right in front of my eyes. Jasmine turned her absolute fury onto my parents. She screamed at Susan, telling her this was her fault for raising such a weak, pathetic excuse for a man. She accused my mother of coddling Brandon his entire life, turning him into a parasite who did not know how to tell the truth. Susan immediately whipped around, her polished country club manners entirely forgotten. She yelled right back at Jasmine, telling her she was nothing but a gold digger who only married Brandon for his supposed wealth. Susan shouted that Jasmine was perfectly happy to spend the money when she thought it was real and had absolutely no right to play the victim now. Richard tried to intervene, shouting at both women to stop tearing the family apart. Brandon finally stood up, screaming at his father for airing his dirty laundry in front of me. He blamed Richard for giving him the money in the first place, claiming that if Richard had just let his tech company fail years ago, he would not be in this humiliating mess. It was an absolute bloodbath. They were tearing each other to pieces. The golden child was exposed as a fraud. The authoritative father was exposed as a thief. The proud mother was entirely broken. And the entitled wife was staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. They had spent my entire life standing shoulder to shoulder, united in their shared contempt for me. But the moment the money disappeared, their loyalty vanished right along with it. I simply stood at the head of the table, a silent observer in my own home. I picked up my crystal water glass, took a slow, refreshing sip, and watched the magnificent destruction of the people who had tried to break me. But as satisfying as it was to watch them rip each other apart, I knew the show was not over. Jasmine was angry about the gambling debts and the empty bank accounts, but she still believed her physical home was safe. I gently set my glass down and prepared to deliver the final fatal blow to Brandon's marriage. My father realized that the forensic audit sitting on the table was a live grenade that had just destroyed his marriage and was rapidly dismantling his son's life. The corporate calm he had spent decades cultivating completely evaporated. Richard lunged across the massive mahogany dining table. He completely ignored the shattered crystal and the spilled red wine soaking into the expensive linen tablecloth. He reached out with both hands, trying to snatch the thick-bound financial report right out from under Jasmine's fingers. But Jasmine was much faster and driven by pure survival instinct. She pulled the heavy book tightly against her chest, leaning back in her chair to keep it out of his reach. Richard slammed his hands down on the table, breathing heavily, and demanded that she give it to him. He shouted that the document was illegally obtained confidential financial information and that he had every right to confiscate it and throw it in the fireplace. Jasmine glared at him, holding the book like a shield. She told her father-in-law that if he took one more step toward her, she would call the police and hand the audit directly to the authorities herself. Richard froze. The threat of criminal charges from his own daughter-in-law finally broke his aggressive momentum. He stood there, chest heaving, looking like a trapped animal. That was when Brandon completely unraveled. The reality of his absolute failure was staring him in the face, and his mind desperately scrambled to construct a new lie to save himself. He was sweating so profusely that his designer dress shirt was clinging to his shoulders. He walked around the table, holding his hands up in a placating gesture, trying to approach his wife. He told Jasmine that she was looking at the numbers all wrong. He stammered out a rapid-fire string of corporate buzzwords, desperately trying to spin his massive gambling losses into a legitimate business strategy. He claimed that the millions of dollars drained from the trust fund were just a temporary bridge loan. He insisted that the money was necessary to keep his tech startup afloat during a critical development phase. Jasmine did not budge. She asked him how spending $2 million at high-stakes baccarat tables in Las Vegas was considered software development. Brandon wiped the sweat from his forehead, his eyes wide and frantic. He actually had the audacity to claim that those casino trips were exclusive networking events. He told his wife that to secure massive funding, you had to play with the heavy hitters. He said he was rubbing shoulders with high-net-worth individuals, and venture capitalists who only did business in VIP rooms. He swore on his life that he was just doing whatever it took to build a relationship with the right investors. It was the most pathetic display of delusion I had ever witnessed. I stood at the head of the table and asked Brandon what kind of legitimate venture capital firm required a startup founder to place $50,000 bets on a roulette wheel to secure a pitch meeting. Brandon whipped his head toward me, pointing a shaking finger. He screamed at me to shut my mouth. He shouted that I did not understand the tech industry because I was just a corporate vulture who fed on dead companies. He puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim a fraction of his lost arrogance. He told the entire room that his social media algorithm was completely revolutionary. He claimed that despite the temporary cash flow issues, his company was currently on the verge of $1 billion valuation. He turned back to Jasmine, dropping to his knees right there on my expensive hardwood floor. He grabbed the armrest of her chair, pleading with her to just trust him for 3 more days. He brought up the mysterious shadow investor again. He swore to her that a massive private equity firm had already reviewed his patents and was wiring him $3 million first thing Monday morning. He promised Jasmine that this capital injection was just the Series A funding, and that by next year they would be billionaires. He told her they would buy a private island and laugh about this minor bump in the road. Susan, who was still weeping quietly in her chair, looked at her son with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. She finally saw him for what he truly was, a desperate gambling addict trying to fast talk his way out of a corner. Richard, however, was still trying to fight me. He could not accept that his daughter had defeated him. He pointed at me, his face twisted in rage, and told me that I had violated serious corporate espionage laws by investigating him. He threatened to call his friends on Wall Street and have me blacklisted from the financial industry. He said he would make sure I lost my managing director position by the end of the week. I looked at my father with absolute pity. I calmly reminded him that he was a mid-level executive at a regional supply chain company who had just confessed to committing federal wire fraud in front of 4 witnesses. I told him he did not have the power to blacklist a junior bank teller, let alone a senior partner at Oakmont Capital. I told him his threats were as entirely worthless as his son's startup company. Brandon ignored our exchange completely. He was still on his knees, practically begging Jasmine to focus on the $3 million arriving on Monday. He promised her that the wire transfer would immediately pay back the trust fund, wipe out the credit card debt, and fix every single mistake he had made. He told her their house was safe, their future was safe, and their baby was going to grow up in unimaginable wealth. He was so deeply committed to the lie that he walked right into the next trap. I watched Jasmine look down at her husband, her expression completely unreadable. She was gripping the forensic audit so tightly her knuckles were white. Brandon had just sworn to her that their physical house was safe. It was the perfect moment to prove him wrong. I reached out and tapped my fingernail against the heavy mahogany table, drawing Jasmine's attention back to me. I tapped my fingernail against the heavy mahogany table. The sharp clicking sound cut through the frantic begging coming from my brother. Jasmine dragged her eyes away from her pathetic husband and looked at me. I instructed her to ignore his rambling. I told her that since Brandon was so incredibly confident that their physical home was completely safe, she needed to verify that fact for herself. I told her to turn to the very last page of the thick financial report. Jasmine flipped past the casino ledgers, the wire transfer receipts, and the shell company bank statements. The heavy paper slapped loudly against the wood until she reached the back cover of the bound folder. Tucked inside a clear plastic sleeve at the very end was a copy of a legal document filed with the county clerk just 4 months ago. Jasmine pulled the paperwork out of the sleeve. I watched her dark eyes scan the header of the first page. It was the property deed to the 4-bedroom luxury house they currently lived in. The exact same house my parents had proudly helped them secure the down payment for a few years prior. Attached directly to that property deed was a massive commercial lending agreement. I walked slowly around the dining table and stood just behind Jasmine's chair. I leaned over and pointed at the loan principal amount printed in bold black ink. I told her it was a third mortgage. I explained that after Brandon had completely drained the trust fund and maxed out all of their joint personal credit cards, his fake tech company still desperately needed cash to make payroll. He needed to pay his handful of employees and his office lease, so no one would realize his revolutionary startup was actually an empty shell. So he leveraged the only piece of equity he had left. Jasmine sat completely rigid. She did not blink. I reached down and tapped my finger on the bottom of the second page, right next to the borrower authorization lines. I told her to look very closely at the signatures. There was Brandon's messy, arrogant scrawl right on the primary borrower line. And sitting right below it on the designated line requiring the legal spouse's explicit consent was Jasmine's perfectly looped signature. Jasmine's eyes locked onto the blue ink. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. Even my parents had stopped their vicious shouting match to watch the scene unfold. Jasmine's voice dropped to a deadly quiet whisper. It was barely louder than the hum of the central air conditioning, but it commanded the absolute terrified attention of every single person in the room. She asked Brandon what he had done. Brandon tried to stand up, but his legs seemed to completely fail him. He stayed on his knees, resting his trembling hands on the edge of the dining table. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly in his throat. He tried to force out a reassuring laugh, but it sounded exactly like a dying animal. He told her it was just a standard administrative formality. He claimed the commercial bank needed both of their names on the application to process the bridge loan faster and keep the interest rate low. Jasmine did not raise her voice. She did not scream or throw things like my mother had. She simply leaned forward, gripping the legal paperwork so tightly the edges of the paper began to tear. She looked down at Brandon and stated as a pure, absolute fact that she was visiting her mother in Atlanta on the exact date this document was notarized. She told him she had never seen this loan agreement in her entire life. She asked him directly if he had forged her signature. She asked him if he had committed a federal felony to take out a massive predatory loan against the house where they were supposed to raise their unborn child. Brandon started crying. Actual tears streamed down his face, ruining his expensive cologne and his carefully maintained golden boy image. He reached out, trying to touch her arm, but Jasmine recoiled, as if he were made of poison. Brandon sobbed, claiming he only did it to protect her. He used her pregnancy as an excuse, saying he did not want to stress her out with complicated business finances. He swore over and over again that the $3 million capital injection arriving on Monday would pay off the third mortgage completely, and she would never even have to worry about the paperwork again. Jasmine slowly shook her head. She looked at the man she had married with absolute, unadulterated disgust. She told him he did not forge her name to protect her. She told him he did it because if he had asked her to sign a third mortgage, she would have demanded to see his company financial statements, and his entire house of cards would have collapsed months ago. She told him he had actively risked their home, her credit, and her legal freedom, just so he could keep playing pretend with his friends. I decided to add the final log to the fire. I looked at Jasmine and told her that Brandon did not just trace her signature. I explained that my private investigators had looked into the transaction. Brandon had bribed a notary public who owed him a favor from his casino days to legally stamp the lending documents without Jasmine being present in the room. I told her we already had a sworn statement from the notary confessing to the entire fraudulent scheme. Jasmine realized in that exact moment that Brandon was not just a bad businessman. He was not just a degenerate gambler. He was a dangerous criminal who had actively stolen her identity and weaponized her legal standing to fund his massive failures. If his fake company defaulted on that commercial loan, the bank would not just ruin him. They would come after her wages, her credit, and her personal assets. She was legally bound to a crushing debt she had never consented to. She stared at him as if he were an absolute monster. The golden boy was completely destroyed, stripped of every lie he had ever told. But Brandon, in his absolute terrifying delusion, still clung to his imaginary lifeline. He pointed a shaking finger at me and shouted through his tears that I was deliberately trying to turn his own wife against him. He screamed that I was jealous and evil. He swore to Jasmine that Monday would prove everyone wrong. He chanted about the ghost investor, the magical private equity firm that was going to wire him $3 million and save his life. I smiled a genuine warm smile. It was finally time to introduce my brother to his savior. When I told Jasmine I was about to introduce Brandon to his savior, the entire room seemed to freeze for a split second. But before I could even take another breath, the fragile tension snapped. Jasmine completely ignored my statement. Her mind was entirely consumed by the horrifying reality of the forged legal documents sitting right in front of her. She dropped the heavy paper onto the table as if the ink itself was burning her fingers. She stepped toward Brandon, her voice escalating from a deadly whisper into a full-blown visceral scream. She demanded to know if the commercial bank was going to foreclose on their home. She asked him point-blank how many payments he had missed on a third mortgage she never even knew existed. She wanted to know if the house they had spent months decorating for their unborn baby was already slipping through their fingers. Brandon could not form a single coherent sentence. He was stuttering, his hands hovering in the air like a cornered animal. He tried to tell her that the mortgage was simply in a temporary grace period and that she was overreacting. But Jasmine was far too intelligent to believe another pathetic lie. She stepped even closer, backing him against the edge of the heavy dining table. She demanded the absolute truth, asking him if they were going to be evicted and thrown out onto the street before their child took its first breath. The public humiliation was too much for Brandon's fragile ego. He was losing absolute control of his wife in front of the sister he had spent his entire life despising. His desperate need to maintain his fake golden boy image overrode his common sense. He lunged forward and grabbed Jasmine's arm, his fingers digging hard into the expensive silk fabric of her maternity dress. He hissed at her to lower her voice, telling her she was acting completely unhinged and humiliating him in front of our parents. That was the worst possible mistake he could have ever made. Jasmine did not cower, and she did not quiet down. She violently shoved him away. She planted both of her hands squarely on his chest and pushed with so much explosive force that Brandon completely lost his footing. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished marble floor, and crashed hard into one of my heavy mahogany dining chairs. The chair tipped over backward, hitting the ground with a loud, sharp crack that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Jasmine pointed down at him, her entire body shaking with pure adrenaline and rage. She warned him to never lay a hand on her again. She laid bare every single lie he had ever sold her. She screamed that she thought she had married a brilliant visionary entrepreneur. Instead, she realized she had tied her life to a pathetic thief who had to steal his pregnant wife's identity just to pay for his offshore gambling addiction. She told him he was completely hollow, a fake man playing a fake game, and that she was a fool for ever believing he was a king. While Jasmine's marriage was violently detonating at one end of my dining room, my parents were actively destroying theirs at the exact same time. Susan had completely lost whatever remained of her polished, polite country club composure. She was absolutely hysterical. She grabbed my father by the lapels of his tailored suit jacket, screaming directly into his face with tears streaming down her cheeks. She demanded that Richard explain himself. She asked him how he could drain her own father's trust fund and betray her so completely just to protect a son who was clearly a failure. Richard tried to violently pry her hands off his jacket, shouting right back at her. He completely shifted the blame, saying she was the one who coddled Brandon from birth and demanded they maintain an impossibly wealthy image. He yelled that he was just trying to clean up the massive financial mess she created by raising such an entitled, useless child. Susan hit him in the chest, sobbing that he had sacrificed their entire retirement, their legacy, and their social standing for a fake tech company that produced absolutely nothing but debt. She wailed that when her friends at the country club found out about the embezzlement, they would be complete social pariahs. I stood perfectly still at the head of the table, watching the absolute carnage unfold. It was a flawless masterpiece of destruction. The perfect American family, the ones who had spent 34 years looking down their noses at me, were tearing each other to shreds right in the middle of my formal dining room. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. They had arrived at my $4.5 million estate, fully expecting to mock a cramped apartment and laugh at my supposed failures. Instead, they were leaving in absolute financial and emotional ruins entirely by their own design. The air was filled with the deafening sound of Susan's sobbing Richard's defensive shouting and Jasmine's relentless verbal assault. Brandon was still sitting on the floor, leaning against the overturned mahogany chair. He looked up at Jasmine, his face stained with tears and sweat. He was entirely broken, stripped of his arrogance and his fake wealth. He had absolutely nowhere to run, so he resorted to the very last defense mechanism he had left. He started screaming over the noise. He shouted at Jasmine to stop packing her bags in her head. He screamed at our parents to shut their mouths. He crawled up from the floor, his voice completely raw and desperate. He started chanting about his imaginary savior again. He yelled that none of this mattered because of Monday morning. He pointed his finger at the ceiling, acting as if financial salvation was guaranteed by the universe. He swore to Jasmine that the shadow investor was completely legitimate. He screamed that the massive private equity firm had already signed the final term sheets. He promised his wife that the $3 million would hit his corporate bank account at 9 in the morning on the dot. He said he would pay off the forged mortgage, reimburse the family trust fund, and make everything perfectly right before anyone could file charges. I let him scream his empty promises. I let him build his final desperate fantasy right in front of the people he had betrayed. I took a slow, calming breath and prepared to deliver the absolute final blow. Brandon scrambled up from the polished marble floor, using the edge of the mahogany table for support. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and his face was slick with a mixture of sweat and tears, but the sheer force of his own delusion gave him a sudden burst of manic energy. He pointed a shaking finger at me, but he kept his eyes locked entirely on Jasmine. He was desperately trying to construct one final fortress of lies to protect his golden boy image from absolute destruction. He shouted over the lingering echoes of our parents' argument, demanding that everyone shut their mouths and listen to him. He claimed that the forged mortgage and the emptied trust fund were completely irrelevant details. He yelled that a massive private equity group called Horizon Capital Partners had already completed their due diligence on his software. He told the room that they had audited his code, analyzed his market projections, and recognized him as an absolute visionary. Brandon puffed out his chest, his voice growing louder and more confident with every lie he spun. He swore to Jasmine that the final term sheets were already signed and legally binding. He promised her that a wire transfer for exactly $3 million was scheduled to hit his corporate account at 9 o'clock sharp on Monday morning. He painted a glorious picture of their immediate future. He said he would march into the commercial bank by noon and pay off the third mortgage in full. He told our father he would replace the stolen trust fund money by Tuesday, so no one would ever have to worry about an investigation. Then he turned his arrogant glare back to me. The sheer audacity of this man was breathtaking. Even while standing in the wreckage of his own life, he still felt the desperate need to prove he was superior. He looked around my $4.5 million home and sneered. He told me that $3 million was just the initial seed round. He claimed that by next year his company would be publicly traded and he would be worth hundreds of millions. He actually threatened to buy the empty lot next to my estate just so he could build a mansion twice the size and bulldoze my property out of pure spite. I watched the absolute poison of his words seep into the room. The most terrifying part was not that Brandon was lying. The most terrifying part was watching my family eagerly swallow the lie. Richard slowly lowered his hands, completely forgetting his vicious argument with Susan. The authoritative corporate executive was suddenly back, clinging to this imaginary financial lifeline. He adjusted his suit jacket and asked Brandon if it was true. He asked if Horizon Capital had really committed to Tier 1 institutional backing. When Brandon eagerly nodded, my father actually smiled. The threat of federal prison vanished from his mind, replaced instantly by the promise of corporate prestige. Susan wiped her theatrical tears with her linen napkin. She looked at her son with a renewed spark of pride, completely willing to ignore the fact that he was a degenerate gambler and a criminal as long as he was going to be a rich one. Even Jasmine hesitated. Her survival instinct was warring with her anger. The mention of a $3 million wire transfer made her pause. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, glaring at him. She told Brandon that if that money did not clear by Monday morning, she was calling her divorce lawyers and going straight to the police with the forged deed. But the very fact that she issued a deadline meant she was holding out hope. She wanted to believe the fairy tale. She wanted to believe her lavish lifestyle was safe. They were all standing on the deck of a sinking ship, happily convincing each other that the water rising around their ankles was just an illusion. They were so desperate to be saved that they were willing to trust the very man who had drilled the hole in the hull. I stood quietly at the head of the table, observing their collective madness. I reached out and picked up my crystal wine glass. I poured a fresh splash of the $500 vintage red wine, letting the rich liquid breathe for a second. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The taste was absolutely perfect. I set the glass down and smiled. A genuine warm smile that made the hairs on the back of Brandon's neck stand up. I spoke in a calm, even tone that sliced right through their renewed excitement. I said we needed to have a very serious conversation about that investor. Brandon scoffed, crossing his arms, trying to look intimidating. He told me I was just jealous that a real financial institution had finally recognized his genius. He told me I could not handle the fact that he was about to outshine my entire career with a single massive deal. I ignored his insults. I asked him a very simple question. I asked him to tell the room the name of the senior partner at Horizon Capital who had personally signed his term sheet. Brandon blinked. He stuttered for a fraction of a second before confidently throwing out a generic name. He claimed it was a man named David Sterling, a senior vice president of acquisitions. He said David had flown out from New York specifically to shake his hand and close the deal over an expensive steak dinner. I nodded slowly, pretending to be impressed. Then I asked him another question. I asked him if David Sterling had gone over the specific stipulations in Section 4, Paragraph B of the binding agreement. Brandon's confident smirk faltered. He shifted his weight nervously from one foot to the other. He asked me what I was talking about. He told the room that corporate contracts were highly confidential and he was not going to discuss his proprietary business terms with a jealous sister. I did not let him off the hook. I kept my eyes locked on his and began to recite the exact legal phrasing of his confidential contract purely from memory. I stated that Section 4, Paragraph B explicitly outlined a total forfeiture of all intellectual property, corporate assets, and personal collateral in the event that the founder was found guilty of financial misrepresentation or fraud prior to the disbursement of funds. The blood instantly drained from Brandon's face. He took a step back, bumping into the table. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stared at me in absolute horror, wondering how a glorified paper pusher could possibly know the exact wording of a highly classified non-disclosure agreement that had only been signed 48 hours ago. Jasmine looked at Brandon and then looked at me, her intelligent eyes widening as she connected the dots. Richard stopped adjusting his jacket, his face turning pale once again. The fragile bubble of hope they had just blown was rapidly expanding, and I was holding the needle. I reached back into the thick manila folder resting on the table. I told Brandon that David Sterling was indeed a very nice man. But I clarified that David did not fly out from New York to shake his hand. I told my brother that David worked for me. I pulled the final document from the folder and prepared to show Brandon the true face of his imaginary savior. I reached my hand into the thick manila folder for the final time. The dining room was so quiet that the faint rustle of the paper sounded like a thunderclap. I pulled out a crisp stack of legal documents bound by a heavy black clip. I did not slide this one across the table. I held it up so the light from the crystal chandelier caught the embossed logo at the top of the page. It was the Horizon Capital Partners emblem. The exact company Brandon had just staked his entire life and marriage on. I dropped the stack of papers directly onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. I told Brandon to look very closely at the bottom of the first page right below the Horizon Capital logo. I told him to read the fine print that he was apparently too arrogant or too desperate to read when he signed his life away. Brandon leaned forward, his hands shaking so violently he could barely grip the edge of the table. He stared at the small black text. He read it out loud, his voice cracking into a pathetic whisper. Horizon Capital Partners, a wholly owned subsidiary of Oakmont Capital Group. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I watched the absolute crushing reality wash over my brother's face. I told him that Horizon Capital was not an independent venture capital firm from New York. I explained that it was a specialized shell company created by my private equity firm specifically to acquire toxic, distressed debt from failing tech startups. I looked at my father, who was gripping the back of his chair, looking as though he might pass out. I told Richard that when his golden boy started defaulting on his massive commercial loans, his corporate profile was automatically flagged in our system. I told them that David Sterling did not seek Brandon out because he thought Brandon's algorithm was revolutionary. David Sterling is a junior acquisitions manager who reports directly to my desk. I told them I was the one who handed David the file. I was the one who instructed him to fly out and buy Brandon an expensive steak dinner. I was the one who authorized the drafting of that completely predatory contract. I took a step toward Brandon, looking down at him with zero pity. I told him there was no magical shadow investor coming to save him. I told him I am the investor. The room seemed to physically tilt as the power dynamic shattered permanently. Brandon stumbled backward, hitting the wall. He shook his head frantically, muttering that it was a conflict of interest, that it was illegal, and that he would have the entire contract voided in federal court. I laughed a genuine cold laugh. I told him it was not illegal because my name was nowhere on the localized paperwork and he had willingly signed a legally binding corporate buyout agreement without ever consulting a competent lawyer. I reminded him that he was so desperate to look like a successful tech founder in front of his friends and his pregnant wife that he signed a 60-page financial document just because someone promised him $3 million. I told Jasmine to look at the paperwork. I told her that the $3 million Brandon kept screaming about was never a capital investment to help his company grow. I explained that it was a hostile buyout. I told her that my firm had secretly purchased every single outstanding loan Brandon's company had, including his office leases, his vendor debts, and the loans he took out using the stolen trust fund money. I looked back at my brother and delivered the ultimate checkmate. I told him I owned his corporate debt, every single penny of it. I told him that because I held his debt, I was legally the primary lien holder on his entire fake empire. Brandon was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he slid down the wall and collapsed onto the hardwood floor. Susan let out a soft, horrified wail, covering her face with her hands. She finally understood that the daughter she had treated like a failure had just legally and financially consumed her favorite child. Richard stepped forward, his corporate instincts trying to find a loophole, a desperate way out of the trap. He raised his hands and tried to use his calm, negotiating voice. He told me that even if I owned the debt, Brandon still owned the intellectual property. He claimed that Brandon's social media algorithm was still worth millions and that they could sell the patents to outside buyers to pay me off. I turned my cold gaze to my father and completely destroyed his last shred of hope. I reminded him of Section 4, Paragraph B, the exact clause I had recited from memory just moments ago. I told Richard that by committing financial fraud, forging Jasmine's signature on a third mortgage, and embezzling from a family trust, Brandon had automatically triggered the moral turpitude and financial misrepresentation clauses of the Horizon Capital Agreement. I told my father that those clauses explicitly stated that upon breach of contract, all intellectual property patents and corporate assets immediately forfeit to the majority debt holder, which was me. I looked down at Brandon, who was sobbing uncontrollably on my floor. I told him that as of 9 o'clock Monday morning, I did not just own his debt. I owned his company. I owned his patents. I owned the algorithm he spent the last 3 years bragging about. I owned the leased office space and the leased laptops his imaginary employees used. I told him I even owned the corporate lease on the slate gray Porsche currently sitting in my driveway. I told him he was completely and utterly bankrupt. He owned absolutely nothing. Absolutely. He was a ghost in his own life. Jasmine stood perfectly still, her hands resting on her pregnant stomach. She looked from the broken, sobbing man on the floor to the calm, unbothered woman standing at the head of the table. She realized that I had not just exposed her husband's lies. I had systematically trapped him in a cage made of his own arrogance and locked the door from the outside. I looked down at Brandon weeping on the polished hardwood floor. I told him to stop crying and listen to me very carefully. I told him it was time he finally understood how real business was actually conducted. I took a step away from the mahogany table and walked over to where he was slumped against the wall. I methodically broke down the reality of his situation piece by piece. I explained that the $3 million he was so desperately waiting for was never a cash wire transfer meant for his corporate checking account. I told him Horizon Capital did not authorize that money to fund his imaginary marketing campaigns or pay his fake employees. That money was used entirely on the back end to purchase his toxic debt. I told him my firm bought out the commercial bank that held his office lease. We bought out the predatory lenders who held his vendor credit lines. We systematically consolidated every single financial liability his failing startup had so that Oakmont Capital became his sole primary creditor. I watched his bloodshot eyes widen in absolute horror as the mechanical trap finally made sense to his arrogant brain. I told him it was never an investment. It was a perfectly executed hostile takeover. I reminded him that when you sign a Tier 1 institutional funding agreement, you are bound by strict financial covenants. You are legally required to disclose all material risks and provide completely accurate accounting. I pointed out the obvious. I told him that submitting a forged third mortgage to a commercial bank and hiding $1 million in embezzled family trust funds constituted massive financial fraud. I told him that because he committed fraud, the grace period on his corporate debt was officially null and void. I was exercising my contractual right to call in the loan. I demanded immediate repayment of the entire $3 million balance. Brandon choked on a sob. He looked up at me, his hands shaking wildly, and whispered that he did not have that kind of money. I smiled warmly and told him I knew he did not have it. I told him I was counting on it. I explained that because he could not satisfy the immediate repayment, the default clauses activated instantly. I laid out exactly what was going to happen on Monday morning. I told him that at exactly 9 o'clock, my legal team would file the formal foreclosure notices with the state. I told him that the second those papers were stamped, I became the sole legal owner of his entire company. Every single share of stock, every single patent, and every single line of proprietary code belonged to me. I told him I owned his revolutionary social media algorithm. I owned his servers. I owned the expensive ergonomic chairs sitting in his leased office space. I told him I was going to liquidate his entire life work for pennies on the dollar just to use it as a tax write-off for my firm. My father tried to speak up, his voice trembling. He asked if there was any way we could negotiate a payment plan to keep the company in the family. I did not even look at Richard. I kept my eyes locked on my brother. I told Brandon there was no negotiation. I told him the absolute worst part of his situation was not losing the company. The worst part was losing the facade. I reminded Brandon of the arrogant speech he gave at our mother's birthday lunch last Sunday. I reminded him of how he leaned against his slate gray sports car, swirling his wine, and told me I would never be on his level. I told him that I had specifically reviewed his corporate expense reports during the due diligence phase of the buyout. I discovered that he had leased that exact Porsche under the company name to use it as a corporate tax deduction. Brandon let out a sharp, terrified gasp. He realized exactly where I was going. I leaned down slightly, getting closer to his face. I told him that because the car was a corporate asset and I was seizing all corporate assets, the car now belonged to me. I told him that by noon on Monday I would have a private repossession team parked in his driveway to take the keys to his precious Porsche. I told him I might even let my estate security guards use it to patrol the perimeter of my property. Brandon curled in on himself, pressing his face into his knees. The golden child was completely broken. He was sobbing so loudly it echoed off the vaulted ceilings of my grand foyer. He had spent his entire life bullying me, stealing from our family, and lying to his pregnant wife just to maintain the illusion of success. Now the illusion was entirely shattered. I stood back up and delivered the final absolute truth. I told him he was completely bankrupt. He did not have a company. He did not have a car. He did not have a trust fund to steal from anymore. Once the corporate foreclosure was finalized, the commercial banks would come after him personally for the forged third mortgage. He was hundreds of thousands of dollars in the negative with no income, no assets, and a massive fraud investigation hanging over his head. I looked at my mother, who was sitting frozen in her chair, unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of her son's destruction. I looked at Jasmine, who had backed away from Brandon as if his failure was a contagious disease. They were looking at a man whose entire existence had just been legally erased. Then I slowly turned my gaze to my father. Richard was gripping the edge of the table, sweating profusely, staring at the Horizon Capital documents with a look of pure terror. He thought he was just a spectator to his son's ruin. He had absolutely no idea that his own name was explicitly written into the collateral clauses. I picked up the stack of papers and prepared to show my father exactly what it cost to enable a parasite. My father stood up straight and tried to button his tailored suit jacket with shaking hands. He puffed out his chest and desperately tried to summon the booming, authoritative voice he had used to terrorize me during my entire childhood. He pointed a finger at me and ordered me to stop this nonsense immediately. He told me I had made my point and that I had successfully humiliated my brother, but it was time to put an end to this vicious corporate game. He said that family was sacred and that I needed to call my legal team right now to cancel the foreclosure. He told me we would sit down like civilized adults over the weekend and figure out a manageable payment plan for Brandon. He honestly believed he could still dictate terms to me in my own home. I did not call my legal team. I did not soften my expression. I looked at the man who had cut off my college tuition when I was 18 and told him he had absolutely no authority here. I told him he lost the right to speak to me like a father the day he chose to protect a degenerate gambler over his own daughter. I reached into the heavy stack of Horizon Capital paperwork and pulled out a separate packet of documents printed on pale yellow legal paper. I slid them across the mahogany table until they hit the base of his crystal water glass. I told Richard we needed to discuss the early days of Brandon's fake tech startup. I explained that before Brandon started stealing from the family trust fund, he had tried to secure legitimate business loans from commercial banks. But because Brandon had a massive history of gambling debts and zero actual assets, every single reputable bank in the state had rejected his application. I told my father that commercial lenders were not stupid. They knew a terrible investment when they saw one. They refused to give Brandon a single dime unless he had a rock-solid guarantor to back the loan. Richard looked down at the yellow legal paper. His booming, authoritative voice completely vanished. His face turned the color of ash. I watched his eyes scan the top of the page, reading the title of the document. It was a master commercial loan guarantor agreement. I told the room that my father, the brilliant senior corporate executive who prided himself on his financial acumen, had done the absolute dumbest thing a person could possibly do. He had co-signed Brandon's massive business loans. Susan let out another choked gasp. She looked at Richard and demanded to know what I was talking about. She asked him if he had secretly taken on Brandon's debt. Richard could not even look at his wife. He was completely paralyzed, staring at his own signature rendered in black ink at the bottom of the page. I answered for him. I told my mother that Richard did not just co-sign the loan, he had to provide tangible collateral to secure it. I told Susan to brace herself because the truth was going to destroy whatever illusion of security she had left. I explained that Richard had pledged his entire corporate pension as collateral. He had pledged his massive retirement accounts. He had even leveraged the remaining equity in their sprawling Tudor-style suburban home. He had literally bet his entire life savings and his wife's financial future on a social media algorithm that did not even exist. Richard finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a frantic broken whisper. He pointed at the Horizon Capital buyout papers. He claimed that the $3 million buyout was supposed to absorb all of the outstanding commercial debt. He stammered that his guarantor status was supposed to be completely wiped clean the moment Horizon Capital assumed control of the liabilities. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, begging me to confirm that his retirement accounts were safe. I smiled a cold, unforgiving smile. I told my father that under normal circumstances, a standard buyout would indeed release the guarantor. But I reminded him once again of Section 4, Paragraph B, the fraud clause. I explained that because Brandon had actively committed federal wire fraud and forged legal mortgage documents, the Horizon Capital agreement immediately went into default. And when a corporate loan goes into default, due to criminal negligence, the debt does not vanish, it accelerates. I methodically walked him through the financial mechanics of his own ruin. I told him that I was calling in the entire $3 million debt effective Monday morning. I explained that Brandon's fake company had absolutely zero liquid assets to cover that massive deficit. The leased laptops and cheap office furniture I was seizing would barely cover my legal fees. Therefore, as the primary debt holder, I was legally obligated to pursue the guarantor for the remaining balance. I looked my father dead in the eye and delivered the heaviest blow of the night. I told him I was seizing his pension. I told him my legal team had already drafted the paperwork to garnish his senior executive salary, liquidate his retirement accounts, and place a massive lien against his suburban home. I told him that the money he had spent decades accumulating, the wealth he used to control and manipulate our family, now belonged entirely to me. The authoritative patriarch was completely destroyed. His knees buckled and he dropped heavily back into his dining chair. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a raw, agonizing sob that sounded like a building collapsing. Susan started screaming at him, hitting his shoulders, wailing that he had doomed them to live on the streets in their old age. Richard did not even try to defend himself. He just sat there weeping, entirely broken by the daughter he had spent 34 years telling she would never amount to anything. He begged me to reconsider. He told me I was his blood and asked how I could leave my own parents destitute. I calmly reminded him of the words he spoke to me when I was 18 years old. I told him that cutting him off was a calculated strategy designed to build his character. I told him I was just practicing the tough love he had so proudly bragged about during his toast. The absolute destruction of a massive ego is not a quiet event. It is a messy, humiliating spectacle, and I watched it happen right in the middle of my formal dining room. My father had spent his entire life projecting an aura of untouchable corporate authority. He was a man who demanded respect, commanded rooms, and ruled our family with an iron fist. But the moment the reality of his total financial ruin fully registered in his brain, his physical body simply gave out. His knees literally buckled beneath him. He slid out of his heavy mahogany dining chair and hit the polished marble floor with a heavy thud. He did not try to stand back up. He slumped forward, grabbing the edge of the dining table for support, his expensive tailored suit wrinkling around his trembling frame. He was weeping openly, a 60-year-old senior executive sobbing with the frantic, unrestrained panic of a terrified child. He reached one shaking hand out toward me, desperately trying to grab the fabric of my clothing. I calmly took a step backward, refusing to let him touch me. He looked up at me, his face red and swollen, his eyes completely bloodshot. He begged me to show mercy. He choked on his own tears as he pleaded with me to remember that we were family. He used the exact phrase I knew he would use. He asked me how I could possibly do this to my own flesh and blood. I looked down at the pathetic broken man on my floor. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I asked him where his deep devotion to his flesh and blood was when I was 19 years old, working double shifts at a diner just to afford my college textbooks. I asked him where his fatherly mercy was when I begged him for a tiny loan to fix my broken-down car so I could get to my classes, and he hung up the phone on me. I reminded him that while I was eating cheap ramen noodles and terrified of failing out of school, he was happily writing massive checks to fund Brandon's luxury spring break trips to Cabo. I told him he did not care about flesh and blood. He only cared about himself and the fake legacy he was trying to build through his golden child. I told him he made a terrible investment and now the market was simply correcting itself. I turned my attention to Brandon. My brother was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant man who had stood in my driveway just hours earlier bragging about his leased Porsche. He was no longer shouting. He was no longer making wild threats or inventing imaginary venture capitalists. He had crossed the threshold from frantic denial into absolute catatonic shock. Brandon was sitting motionless against the wall, his legs pulled up slightly toward his chest. He was staring blankly at the Horizon Capital documents scattered across the table above him. His eyes were completely empty, devoid of any remaining spark or fight. The manic energy that had fueled his entire life was completely gone. He was finally face to face with his own hollow reflection. He was not a visionary, he was not a tech genius. He was a fraud, a thief, and a failure, and the undeniable legal proof was sitting right in front of him. He did not even flinch when our father wailed his name. He just sat there, a perfectly empty shell of a man, waiting for his impending foreclosure. Then my mother decided to make her final desperate play. Susan had spent her entire life hiding behind my father's money and my brother's supposed potential. But now that both of her shields were destroyed, she tried to save herself by throwing them entirely under the bus. Susan pushed her chair back and stood up. She wiped her tear-streaked face, trying to compose herself, pulling her designer cardigan tight across her chest. She looked at Richard weeping on the floor with absolute disgust. Then she looked at me and tried to force a trembling, sympathetic smile. She told me she had absolutely no idea Richard had leveraged their home. She claimed she was kept entirely in the dark about the stolen trust fund and the commercial loans. She walked toward me holding her hands out pleadingly. She told me she was my mother and that she loved me. She begged me not to take her house. She said she was too old to start over and that she could not bear the humiliation of being evicted in front of her country club friends. She actually promised me that if I let her keep the suburban house, she would divorce Richard and cut Brandon out of her life completely. I stared at her, completely repulsed by her lack of loyalty. I told her to stop talking. I reminded her that she was perfectly happy to sit at my dining table and claim ownership of my success just an hour ago. I told her she had spent my entire life standing by silently while Richard emotionally abused me. She had actively enabled Brandon's narcissism, treating him like a prince while treating me like a servant. I told her that ignorance was not an excuse when she had so willingly enjoyed the lavish lifestyle funded by their theft. I told Susan she was going to lose the house, the country club memberships, and every single piece of jewelry she bought with my grandfather's money. I told her she was going to have to pack her bags and figure out how to survive in the real world, just like they forced me to do 16 years ago. They were completely trapped. The absolute destruction of their egos was finalized. I had systematically dismantled their wealth, their pride, their marriages, and their entire toxic dynamic. There were no legal loopholes left to exploit. There were no shadow investors coming to save them. There were no family guilt trips that could penetrate the ironclad boundaries I had built. The massive dining room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence, punctuated only by the pathetic sound of my father sobbing on the marble floor. I looked past the three of them and locked eyes with Jasmine. The expectant mother was still standing near the edge of the table, her hands resting protectively on her stomach. She had watched my entire family burn to the ground. She knew she was standing in the ashes of her fake marriage, and I knew exactly what she was going to do next. Jasmine stood perfectly still by the edge of the mahogany table, her hands resting protectively over her stomach. She was a highly educated, deeply pragmatic woman, and she had just watched her entire fake reality burn to the foundation. She did not dissolve into theatrical hysterics like my mother. She did not try to aggressively negotiate her way out of the trap like my father. She simply looked at the Horizon Capital documents scattered across the table, looked at the forged mortgage deed bearing her stolen signature, and completed the final mental calculus. The ship she had boarded was entirely underwater, and the man she had married was the one who had anchored it to the ocean floor. There was no magical venture capitalist coming to save them. There was only crushing debt, federal fraud charges, and total financial ruin. Jasmine looked down at her left hand. The massive, flawless diamond engagement ring and the matching diamond wedding band sparkled brilliantly under the light of my crystal chandelier. It was a beautiful set of rings paid for entirely by stolen inheritance and forged commercial loans. Jasmine slowly reached over with her right hand. She did not hesitate for even a fraction of a second. She slid the heavy diamond rings off her finger. She walked slowly around the table to where Brandon was slumped on the polished marble floor. She stood over him for a brief moment, looking down at the golden child who had been completely stripped of his gold. She opened her hand and dropped the rings directly into his lap. They hit his expensive wrinkled suit pants with a dull, heavy thud. Brandon looked up at her, his face a swollen, tear-stained mess. He choked on a sob, weakly reaching out to grab her ankle, begging her not to go. Jasmine took a sharp, disgusted step back, ensuring he could not touch her. She turned her back on her husband and looked across the dining room directly at me. For a long, silent moment, we just stared at each other. There was absolutely no hatred in her eyes anymore. There was no condescension or entitlement. There was only the cold, sharp recognition of one intelligent woman acknowledging another. Jasmine gave me a single slow nod of absolute respect. She told me her lawyers would be in touch with him on Monday morning. Then she turned around, pulled her phone from her designer leather purse, and opened her rideshare app. She walked out of the formal dining room without looking back. Her heels clicked steadily and rhythmically against the marble floor, a sound of pure, unbothered determination. A few moments later, I heard the heavy front door of my estate open and click firmly shut. Jasmine was gone, cleanly securing her own future and leaving my brother to drown in the absolute wreckage of his. Brandon let out an agonizing, guttural wail when the front door closed. He curled into a tight fetal position on the floor, clutching the diamond rings to his chest, sobbing so violently that his entire body shook. My mother was completely paralyzed in her heavy dining chair, her hands covering her mouth, staring blankly at the spilled red wine soaking into the expensive white tablecloth. My father remained slumped against the edge of the table, his breathing shallow and rapid, completely broken by the realization that his pension, his home and his legacy were completely gone. I stood at the head of the table observing the absolute carnage I had orchestrated. I did not feel the urge to scream at them. I did not feel the need to demand apologies for the decades of emotional abuse, the financial isolation, or the endless insults. I had spent 34 years waiting for my family to validate my worth, but looking at the pathetic, broken people scattered around my dining room, I realized their validation was completely worthless. I had already built my own empire, and their opinions no longer held any currency in my world. I looked down at my brother. I kept my voice perfectly even, devoid of any anger or pity. I reminded him of the arrogant insult he had thrown at me in our parents' driveway just a week ago. I told him he had spent his entire life desperately trying to prove he was better than me, using stolen money to build a pedestal he did not earn. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "You wanted to see my level, Brandon. Now you are standing on it, and you do not have the clearance to be here." I turned away from the table and walked over to the discreet digital control panel mounted on the wall near the grand archway. I pressed the security icon on the touchscreen and tapped the emergency dispatch button. Exactly 2 minutes later, a heavy, authoritative knock echoed through the grand foyer. "My private estate security team," Two broad-shouldered men wearing dark suits and earpieces stepped through the front entrance. I walked out to meet them and pointed back toward the formal dining room. I told the guards that these three guests had overstayed their welcome and needed to be escorted off my property immediately. My father did not try to argue. All the aggressive corporate fight had been completely drained out of him. He slowly pulled himself up from the floor, leaning heavily on the table for balance. He looked incredibly old and deeply defeated. He reached a shaking hand out to help my mother out of her chair. Susan let out a soft whimpering cry as the large security guard stepped into the room, but she did not resist. She grabbed her purse and let Richard guide her toward the hallway. Brandon could not walk. The guards had to reach down and physically lift him off the floor by his arms. He remained completely catatonic, his expensive leather shoes dragging across the marble tiles as the security team escorted him out of the dining room and down the long corridor. I followed them out to the front porch. I stood on my granite steps, the crisp autumn air feeling incredibly clean and sharp in my lungs. I watched the security guards ensure that my parents and my brother got into my father's luxury sedan. I watched the engine start, the headlights piercing the darkness of the canyon. I stood there with my hands resting in the pockets of my cashmere sweater, watching the red taillights of their car slowly fade down my long, winding driveway until they disappeared completely past the heavy iron gates. I turned around and walked back inside my beautiful $4.5 million home. I pushed the heavy solid oak double doors closed and locked the deadbolt with a satisfying metallic click. I walked back into the dining room, stepping carefully over my mother's shattered crystal wine glass. I picked up the bottle of vintage red wine and poured myself one final, perfect glass. I walked through the open sliding doors out onto the back patio, standing by the edge of my private infinity pool, looking out over the glittering city lights sprawling across the valley below. I took a slow, deep sip of the wine and basked in the absolute beautiful silence of my hard-earned freedom. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family to build your own success? Have you ever had to quietly build an empire while the people around you underestimated your worth? I would love to hear your stories of resilience and vindication in the comments below. If this journey of claiming back my power resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of surviving and thriving. Remember, your true value is never determined by the people who refuse to see it. It is determined entirely by you. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep building your empire.